welcome to the NCMU podcast, where we are dedicated to raising up and equipping the next generation of nerd culture missionaries and ministers. My name is Mark. I'm the lead pastor of Lux Digital Church, and I am joined today by Giles, who's joining us talking a little bit about Dungeons and Dragons, and not digital, just like local D&D meetups, using those as ministry. Giles, how are you today?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
I'm doing well, Giles. Welcome to the show. I tell you what, let our listeners get to know you a little bit. Give us a little bit of your background, a little bit about what you're into, so we can kind of get to know you a little bit.
All right. Well, I have a long storied history in both Christian content making and just kind of gaming and nerdiness. My parents bought me my first Nintendo or Super Nintendo back in 1993, and since then I've been hooked on games of various kinds. I wasn't allowed to play tabletop games until I moved out on my own. I think I was about 20 or 21 when I played my first Dungeons and Dragons game, but I've been a gamer since I was a little kid. My brother and I got multiple consoles with our birthday and Christmas money and saving up money from work, and we've really built communities around gamers, myself especially, over the last 30 some odd years. With Dungeons and Dragons especially, I built a really nice group of friends that I've been close to probably for the last 20 years, and I even started to get to know my wife through that group as well, and we've been together for 17 years now, and it's been incredible just how gaming has transformed my own life, and my relationship with God has developed so significantly because of the relationships I've built at the gaming tables. And just growing up in the church and around modern Christian culture has given me a lens into what is missing from both secular culture and Christian media, and that's kind of where my passions come together with D&D and building a D&D focused ministry.
That's awesome. And the real question, and the most important one that I'm going to ask you, is: did you play Donkey Kong Country Yellow cartridge? I think it was for Super Nintendo, or was Yellow cartridge N64? There was definitely a Donkey Kong for Super Nintendo where you could get on a swordfish. I will never forget that.
Yeah, I don't remember which one that was. I want to say that might have been Donkey Kong Country 2, but I can't remember. It's been a long time since I played. I don't remember the color of the cartridge, but I do remember my brother and I got super excited because my grandma got that for us as a combined birthday and Christmas present, and it was the game to have when it came out. So I definitely played a lot of that game.
Yeah, I remember I didn't own it because we didn't have a Super Nintendo. We were always sort of a generation behind. We would always buy up of my cousins when the new one would come out. But my friend and kind of pseudo neighbor, I grew up in the country, so sort of cornfield neighbor, right? Like a long jaunt through a cornfield, had a Super Nintendo and had the Donkey Kong game. And I remember playing the crap out of that game, and it's just like one of the most nostalgic games for me is Super Nintendo Donkey Kong on the swordfish. Just so iconic. Well, that's awesome. So you grew up in the church as well, but you said you weren't allowed to play D&D until tabletop games until you moved out of your house. Did you grow up in an environment in a home that was kind of like D&D is for the devil?
It wasn't talked about very much. I don't think it was something that really came up a whole lot, even though my dad at Biola University, when he was attending in the 70s, he did play Dungeons and Dragons a bit with his roommates. But in my own family, it only came up in, I think I was maybe 16 or 17, so I finally had a car and could drive to the mall and look at the game stores, and they had some of the games. And I suspected, based on what I knew about my parents, that they wouldn't approve of me playing Dungeons and Dragons, but would have been fine with picking up the Star Wars games. I think that was around the same time that 3.5 was just getting launched. Might have been 3.0 at the time. So the WotC rules, the D20 system for Star Wars and everything. And so my brother and I really looked into that, but we didn't have the money for it at the time. So in general, it wasn't something that came up. We did have a couple of audiobooks that we listened to as families where they did really perpetuate the satanic panic. And so I think that's where I understood instinctively that my parents wouldn't approve. And then once I became an adult and started playing on my own, I had a younger sibling who was playing as well and really got into it. And I think my mom understood that my mom was the one who objected more more strongly to those types of games than my dad. I think my mom understood that it is just a game if you play it as just a game. It's all about how you use it.
I look behind me because somewhere in the studio, and I don't know where it's sitting, is the Wizards of the Coast Star Wars book and it was 3.0. It was before 3.5 D&D came out, because I played 3.5 D&D in 6th, 7th grade. Somewhere around there, 3.5 came out. My buddy and I started playing 3.5. But
Making
somewhere in there, I did pick up this. What was that?
Making me feel old there.
Yeah, well, I'm old too, man. You know, I'm not even getting into the joke where our video director was born in the year 2000, and so he just left and said something just like nonchalantly on his way out that made me feel ancient. But yeah, I remember going to work. My mom owned a business where she made wedding cakes. I would go with her. We would deliver the wedding cakes, and then I would get paid a couple of bucks, and I could stop at the game shop on the way home, and I would buy a new Dungeons and Dragons book. And so I will always remember buying the 3rd edition Faerun Guide, the Star Wars book, the D20 Modern book, bringing those things home and playing with my friends. A lot of really great memories. But of course, post high school, in college, was where we really sunk our teeth in and really built gaming groups. So what I love about one of the things you said, Giles, is like all of these relationships and connections that you have built, that have developed, because I have friends that I've had for 20 some years that I've been playing games with. So Giles, tell me a little bit about why you think gaming is so important for the development of relationship, or can be really important in the development of relationship.
When we're at a gaming table, we're telling stories together. If we look at the history of humankind, one of the things I learned in college when I was earning my biblical studies degree is that a significant portion of the Bible, before they had really started writing down a lot of the histories, was passed down through oral traditions that were as strict as the written traditions, making sure that it was word for word the same story every single time. Story is what builds communities. Our shared heritage and the things that we connect with our neighbors, they're built around stories, legends of who we came from and where we're going. And when we tell those types of stories at the gaming table, we're making a connection with each other based on the things that we're doing to change the story that we're interacting with. Both the GM and the players ideally are collaborating in making that experience a real thing. When the GM and the players are adversaries, it can be a different circumstance. Not always bad, but that's not the direction I tend to encourage. But it's the stories that we tell that build the connections, because we're growing closer to each other and getting to know who we are through those stories and where we came from and where we want to go.
Yeah, there's something really powerful about, me, and I have a couple of guys. We got together in 2022, I think, and we rented an Airbnb because some of these guys lived out of state. Everybody drove or flew in, and we all just went up in the Airbnb and we played. But I think the first night, more than playing anything, and we did have lengthy 6, 7, 10-hour sessions in role-playing games. We played a couple different games. But before any of that, each one of us had brought a notebook or a folder with us of old D&D characters from game campaigns when we were 14, 15, 16, 18, 22. Now all of us in our 30s rehashing memories of monsters slain and dungeons delved and NPCs interacted with and characters that we shared together. Those iconic moments for us are really powerful. Like, there's things in that bound our friendships, and we're not all as close as we used to be. I don't want to give the impression that like these are like inseparable bonds that you get in the heat of war if you're a soldier, but they are in some ways shared stories, shared narratives, shared experiences that it's so funny looking back on them. I think, at 14, 15, 16 years old, our games were just bad, but they're some of my best and fondest memories. And I have these rose tinted glasses with them that enables us to build relationships. So I think both of us see that, and that's one of my favorite things about Dungeons and Dragons. It's one of the reasons we have a D&D outreach inside of our church at Lux. But you've taken this even a step further to develop something almost entirely other, in order to connect faith and biblical truth and your clear love of both, theology and deep exegesis and biblical study, also to the tabletop gaming space. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so a while back, I want to backtrack a little bit to how I kind of got started in this. Like I had mentioned earlier, I grew up in the Christian media world. My parents owned an audio-video company that traveled around the country running sound for Christian conferences and conventions. So I grew up meeting a lot of big-name Christian artists, like Sherry Kagi, Phil Kagi was another one. We worked with Point of Grace and FFH, a bunch of CCM names that some people may hear and remember. But I grew up wanting to be a part of the face of that type of media and really engaging in culture in that way. And I thought, I don't want to be in direct ministry. I want to be a performer and an entertainer. And then when I become rich and famous, I can point to God, not in a health and wealth mentality kind of way, more as just people see what's going on. I have their attention, and then I can point directly to Christ. And then when I have a lot of money, I can use that to support people who are actually qualified to be ministers. Fast forward 20 some years, and there's a point where a position opened up for me to step into a leadership role at the church that I attend, and I went through the process of becoming a teaching elder, learned how to do all of the correct biblical exegesis and teach and preach well from somebody who has 10 years of seminary training. And I got done with that, got ordained, and I was challenged to write a sermon series. And I thought, if I'm going to pick a topic to write on, I want to figure out a way to fix a problem that I have. Let me figure out how to write a nice little checklist on how to become good at biblical contentment, which I learned isn't something that you can do with a checklist, and I knew that instinctively going into it. But I had a crisis moment in the midst of writing that sermon series and realized what I really wanted to do was go into full-time ministry, but I didn't have the skills to do so. And I didn't know what that ministry would look like because the church is so small that it wasn't going to be working full-time for the church. And then I had been podcasting for about 6 or 7 years at that point and thought maybe I'll develop a podcast type ministry, but I need to go to school. So I went and earned my biblical studies degree, and about 2 years into that, I realized I'm really close with the gaming community that I've developed, and I really love games. A pastor for a church that I had grown up with was the chaplain for the Denver Broncos for many years, and I thought, what if I could do that for maybe an Overwatch League team? I was really into Overwatch League at the time, and thought that would be an incredible opportunity, ministering to these young kids, being a team chaplain for them, and being involved in gaming all at the same time, but not knowing what it would take to become a chaplain. And the longer I considered all of that, the more I realized the face-to-face interactions with the people in my gaming community at the local D&D groups was where I really wanted to focus my efforts. And I also recognized that there was a lot of damage done in the satanic panic between the D&D community and the church. And I wanted to start developing resources that could bridge that gap while also making sure that the games are played in a God-honoring way, whether that's just making sure that we're playing games in a way that reflects biblical values or using games to teach biblical values, kind of the way that organizations are using it for clinical mental health counseling. I thought if it works for counseling, why not for biblical study? And then the OGL debacle hit with Dungeons & Dragons. So instead of trying to do some kind of off-licensing of one of the really easy-to-use games that's already out there, I jumped in and created a really simple D6 system. I call it Royal Priesthood Role-Playing Game, or RP2 for short. The name of the organization that publishes that is the Ministry. It's Disciple Gaming Ministry. And basically it's a 64-page PDF that you can get from my website for free. You don't even have to give me your contact information. Just agree that you don't own it and that you're not going to sell it. And the first half walks players through creating a character, and then the second half walks dungeon masters or game masters through the process of creating encounters that are based off of passages in the Bible. In the book itself, I do an entire walkthrough of how to create a game campaign arc through the book of Ezra. And it starts from chapter 1 all the way through the very last chapter, where the characters are learning the biblical principles behind each chapter, and they're applying the doctrines at the table while learning history and imagining themselves in encounters that are close to the biblical history. So they're not trying to change the events of that story, but they're distant witnesses, almost as if we're watching through a safari, like a safari jeep or something like that. So we're not there to change it, but we're there to witness it in a little bit closer, imaginative way, while applying doctrines at the table. It's a three-pronged approach of learn the history and the principles, and then apply them right away.
So interesting. I really like that, and we'll put in the show notes a link to your website so people can find that as a resource. Listen, we have plenty of people who listen to this who are nerds, just like me, right? Gamer nerds, and in our outreach ministry, we're heroic characters, but there's nothing that's biblical in terms of how we're doing things. What we do is we offer to pray for people at the end, take prayer concerns, and then once they're in our server, gives us opportunity to invite them to come to services with us and just interface with believers who don't hate them, which is usually a good starting point for a lot of people in the D&D community. How do you like just explain to me, or maybe help me understand, like, just a session, if we were to sit down and you were going to play something that was going to be one of these sessions, we're going to try to understand a biblical truth or understand something. Is this something where we're trying to like wrap our mind around the Trinity through an entity in game? Is this something where it's like, no, like we're literally characters in Jericho, or we're literally characters in the Israelite army outside of Jericho? How do you portray those things without it becoming like very clear what the ending is? Because so much in role-playing games is the mystery that you're solving and the fact that you don't know what's in your dungeon master's or your game master's head. But if it's based all around a biblical story, how do you keep an element of surprise or an element of excitement when maybe, let's say, the players around the table know the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego?
Yeah, that's a great point. One of the just a side note to that, one of the issues that I have with a lot of the Star Wars media that's going out right now is it takes place during the same time period as the first trilogy, and I'm not interested in those stories because I know how the overall world changes, and I know that no matter what, the stories aren't going to have the same type of impact that the original films had. So it's a similar issue. In a situation like this, an example that I like to use, and it's actually the primary game demo I use when people want to know how to play the game, is I have about a 2-hour game session that is inspired by Acts chapter 19. It's the riot in Ephesus. And the players are going to start out tasked to escort an offering that's getting sent to Jerusalem down to the port in Miletus. The ship isn't able to stop in the port near Ephesus, so they need to walk a couple of days. I kind of time-bet it. I know that the journey itself isn't actually a 3 days walk, but I make the players do a 3-day walk, so that way they have 3 days of things that they can do, and their first day is when the riot first picks up. So the first challenge that they have to do is escape the city with all of this chaos going on after walking out of a church service where they were given this task to escort this money offering that's going to Jerusalem. And then throughout the journey, they're going to face various normal trials that normal people traveling might have run across, and then they're going to hear stories in camps with NPCs, and they're going to discuss the way, which is what it was called back then, with members of the community, have opportunities to try to practice presenting the gospel. So if they're at the table, they can say, well, I'm going to present the gospel in this way, and then they'll tell it how they understand it, and that's an opportunity for them to role play, practicing witnessing and just interacting with other people and defending their own faith.
There is something that's really interesting about playing stories that are adjacent to the biblical narrative, and the riot in Ephesus is a really interesting one to start you in some of that chaos, and as followers of the way amongst it. I think that is it's a really interesting idea, and I think there's probably a lot of stories even from the book of Acts, and then to be on this path where you are doing something that is related to the first church, but you're not doing the thing that the story is about, right? Like the thing that you are doing just happens to be happening around the thing that is going on in the biblical narrative. And because of that, like you're not influencing it, but you are experiencing it. And I think that is a really, really unique and really cool idea, really cool way to do story. So, Giles, one of the things that we like to ask people is, we have a lot of people out there, once again, that love role-playing games. But you have seen this as an opportunity to teach something deeper, to do something kingdom impact-wise with your love for gaming. We probably have some people out there thinking, man, I love D&D, and I'd love to use D&D as a ministry. I'd love to see that become part of my life. So how did you determine that God was really calling you to create this thing? How did you feel led to it?
It wasn't something overt. Like I mentioned earlier, I wanted to be doing some kind of ministry in the gaming space, but in the days when I had wanted to be the famous guy who was then pointing people to the church and giving money to ministry, I knew that a lot of my internal desire was something to make everything about me. I like to say, or at the time I liked to say that no, it's all about pointing glory to God. And really what it was is I wanted to be famous. I wanted to be notable. I wanted people to love it when I walked into a room. And getting into ministry was something that I actively avoided, because when I make ministry about myself, I'm obviously taking things away from God. If I'm dealing with ego between me and God and I'm not in a place of ministry, I'm not necessarily doing the same type of damage as we see with church leaders and ministers who do make ministry about themselves. And I wanted to avoid that. And so the more I thought about, okay, what kind of thing can I do in the gaming sphere? I didn't want to go online and do streaming because I'm not great at playing consistently. I'm not great at playing in general. And so I'm also not good at building and keeping relationships online. I feel much better at building and keeping relationships in person, where I'm meeting them at the local locations. And there's not a whole lot of esports activity in my neighborhood that I'm aware of, but there are a lot of gaming stores where there are weekly, nightly game events, whether it's board games or role-playing games of various types. And I thought, that's a place where I can get involved. That's a place where I can start. And if God leads me other places, then I'm not sure what that's going to look like. But I knew that from the time that I was spending in school and the way that I had built the relationships, that God was first calling me to ministry, like I had said earlier on. That was a process of me praying personally for 6 months, followed by 2 to 3 months praying with my wife, and then another month and a half talking and praying about it with my pastor before we both agreed, yeah, let's get this started. And then another 2 years of training before going into a degree. So it's a lot of prayer, and then God opening the doors. And they weren't big swinging doors with a shining light. It was just, this is the next step that you can take. It's an obvious step, and it's going to require work. And you're praying about it. You're continuing to focus on scripture, and you're not trying to sprint too far ahead. And I think that's been the biggest key for any big changes in my life, is they've come one step at a time, and you only realize where the change is after you look back and realize at each critical moment, even if they were small critical moments, that it was in accordance with the way that God was leading you, because you were in the right space at the right time.
I love that. Well, listen, if you're listening in and you're thinking about also being involved in gaming ministry, contact information for Giles we'll put in the show notes. And better yet, you should come to Nerd Culture Ministry Summit, because Giles is going to be there, and he's going to be leading some D&D one shots that are going to be using some of the system, bringing people around understanding biblical truth and being adjacent to biblical narrative, while sitting around the table and playing D&D. So if you're a youth pastor, man, there's nothing better than this. This is absolute money for reaching a very specific demographic of kid that is always growing inside of your school. Do not miss miss this opportunity. In fact, if you're listening to this and you have a friend who's a youth pastor, you have a youth pastor at your church, give them this podcast episode and say, hey, I want you to listen in on this because I think this is really important for you. Come to Nerd Culture Ministry Summit this November, 12th, 13th, 14th, in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Giles is going to be there. I'm going to be there, along with basically everybody else who's been on this season of NCMU is also going to be there. We have a great crew that are great grouping of keynote speakers. And I think, Giles, you and I are doing a little bit of a workshop as well, where we're going to be handing out some stuff for using both the system that Giles has created, but then also we'll be handing out some materials on how to get your very own larger scale West Marches online campaign going that you can also use as a digital ministry tool, which is what we do at Lux. So, Giles, thank you so much for coming on this episode. Really appreciate the time and energy that you've put into what you've already developed, and thanks for coming and sharing with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
That's going to do it for this episode, guys. Thank you for tuning into the NCMU podcast, and we'll see you on the next episode.